Thank you all very much for coming. A very special presentation for you today, jointly sponsored by Authors at Google and Mosaic, our diversity organization. We're going to have a special double presentation by Michael Erard, linguist and author of Babel No More, a book on hyperpolyglots, and Nataly Kelly, a translator and the author of Found in Translation, a book about the business of translation.
Thank you, and thanks for having us here. This is my first time actually meeting Nataly, although we've corresponded a lot, and this is our first time talking together about these, and we happen to have done these two books about language. And the sort of overarching conceit of polyglots versus translators is that even though the news about languages in the world is that they are dying off at an alarming rate, there are still thousands and thousands of languages, which poses several ways of dealing with that diversity. Google Translate is one. And then there are two sort of other kind of paradigmatic, kind of human approaches, one of which is the polyglot. Just learn all of the languages, learn as many as you can. And the translator, someone who is sort of involved in the import-export business across a few sort of language barriers. And so we've sort of set it up as a contest, in a way.
For translators.
But I think that the goal overall is to talk about differences and ultimately similarities between the two approaches. So Nataly is going to start by talking about sort of translators and where translators come from.
Sure. And we have a little picture that I like to show you, a collage of some translators. And anybody have a guess as to who these guys are? They're not translators, but they're often called translators.
Interpreters for deaf.
Yes, yes. So these three all happen to be interpreters for the deaf. And the reason that I picked them is because you can see the language that they are communicating in. Whereas there are also spoken language interpreters, like at the United Nations, and a lot of people call them translators. So anyone know the difference between the two? Translators and interpreters? Interpreters do work in simultaneous mode, yes. Anything else?
Translators work with text, don't they?
Exactly. So the output for translators is usually text, and the output for interpreters is usually speech or sign language. So that's the basic difference. Now, if you had to guess, where do you think most translators and interpreters live in the world? Where?
Washington, D.C.
There are a lot of interpreters in Washington, D.C. and translators for governmental institutions, yes.
Brussels would be the other.
Brussels, yes. For the European Parliament especially. Anywhere else?
Brigham Young University.
Actually, yes, that's a really good place to recruit translators, because the Mormons tend to go on missions and they learn languages usually at a pretty young age. So when I used to recruit interpreters and translators, I found a lot of really good ones in Utah.
Monterey.
And Monterey. Oh, you're familiar with the language capital of the world, so to speak. Yes, so that's where the Monterey Institute is. That's where most of the conference interpreters get trained. And that is also where the Defense Language Institute is housed. So the answer to where most interpreters and translators are is really in two main areas of the world, and that is in North America and in Western and Northern Europe. So the market is worth $33 billion globally. And about half of that revenue is generated, or I should say is sent to companies within Europe. And about 40% goes to the United States. And the reason the United States is so big is actually not because of domestic reasons, but because of military linguists that have been sent into Afghanistan and Iraq. So as government activity and those military activity decreases, we'll start to see less spending on those areas. So all of these little frames are video stills that come from a video. If you look on YouTube and you put Found in Translation on YouTube, you'll see a video of translators and interpreters from around the world. The answer to where they were born is really anywhere. And we're going to talk later about how they are made, and I think that's a more important question when it comes to translators and interpreters. Before I hand it to Michael to talk about where hyperpolyglots are born or how they're born, a lot of people like to ask me, well, how did you become an interpreter? How did you become a translator? I am a court-certified interpreter for Spanish, and I'm a translator for Spanish into English. And I come from a very small town in the Midwest. Has anyone ever heard of Mason City, Iowa?
Where was the inspiration from River City music announced?
Yes. So Mason City, Iowa is like a metropolis compared to where I'm from. I'm from Mason City, Illinois, which it's about 1 square mile and 2,500 people. So I think that's good testament to the fact that translators and interpreters can really come from anywhere, even where there's absolutely no linguistic diversity and relatively little need for translation and interpreting, largely monolingual town. So I will hand it to Michael to talk about hyperpolyglots.
So I wrote a book about hyperpolyglots, less so polyglots than hyperpolyglots, who are talented language learners and massive language accumulators. The floor for this accumulation is somewhere between 6 and 11 languages, kind of depending on who's doing the counting and also what the languages are. My sort of position is that these are people who have to possess a neurology that's unique and different in order to be able to do this. That's something apart just from language learning aptitude, but that might have something to do with brain plasticity factors, with working memory and executive function skills, with auditory cortex, the ability to hear and discriminate among sounds in one's own native language or in non-native languages. My position is that these are people who are not born and they are not made, but they're born to be made. So really there should be larger numbers of people who possess this neurology all around us, but who never encounter the right sort of environments or conditions to practice and develop what they have. There are a couple of interesting but mostly conjectural theories that are offered for what the components of this particular neurology are and how often it might arise and with what other sorts of conditions. But those are probably so broad that science will never probably explain really what those are. But what is interesting to consider is that there might be some sort of genetic link to this sort of language ability. And since the book came out, certainly heard from a lot of people who not only say, I have this language ability, but it sort of runs in my family. I can do this, and my grandfather can do it, and then it goes pretty far back. I come to this topic because I was working as a language journalist looking for stories to write, and there was a discussion on the linguist list, which is an email listserv for linguists, and the question came up in 2004, who is the world's most lingual person? Which seems like a very, it's a very straightforward question. There should be a straightforward answer. We know how many, we know the person who can eat the most hot dogs in a minute. We know the oldest person in the world. Surely someone has gone out and met this person and measured what they can do. The only organization that had taken any interest in kind of massive multilinguals of this type is the Guinness Book of World Records, which is not the organization that you want in charge of validating claims about multilingualism. So the fact that you had these characters, these people who are these massive language learners, but who were totally ignored by linguistics or applied linguistics or second language acquisition, even though there are some characters, some very famous hyperpolyglots who were themselves linguists, was just a huge sort of hole and a huge opportunity for storytelling and to actually try to apply a little bit of social scientific rigor to it. So that's what I set out to do in the book. Oh, I should have put this slide. These are some of the people that I either write about and or met in the book. This guy right here, I spend quite a bit of time. Do you know who he is? Anyone? Cardinal Mezzofanti, this Italian cardinal of the 18th and 19th centuries, who was said to speak 72 languages, which is a number that has a sort of religious significance because it's said to be the number of languages that was created when the Tower of Babel fell. This guy is Elihu Burritt, who's kind of the American Yankee polyglot, a guy who was made famous by the governor of Massachusetts, actually, because he would spend 12 hours a day working as a blacksmith and then spend another 8 hours every day studying. He apparently taught himself how to read in 50 different languages, although his biographer said it was probably something more like 30 languages. If you ever see the number of languages, I mean, just the size of the numbers that occur, so some skepticism is certainly warranted and welcome here. So the question, how are they made? Want to talk about how translators are made?
Sure. So translators are definitely made, and the reason I told you about my background is because you might wonder, how did I go from being in a rural monolingual town to becoming an interpreter? And I learned Spanish in school, and there were lots of migrant workers in surrounding towns, so every chance I had, I would speak Spanish with them. So from about age 12 to 16, I was speaking Spanish a lot, and I became very passionate about it and interested in Spanish. And maybe this is a characteristic that a lot of us language nerds have, but the first time I got my book, my Spanish textbook, I remember devouring it and calling up one of my friends and saying, hey, do you want to come over and practice Spanish with me? And of course their answer was, no, why would I want to do that? Don't call me anymore. So I realized that not everybody has that love for language. By the time I got to college, my professor who screened me said, I just advise you to go and take all your gen ed courses in Spanish in Latin America because your level is already really high. This will be the way to challenge you. So I did what he said, and I went to Ecuador, and I took my gen ed classes in Spanish. And while I was there, when my professors noticed, she speaks Spanish perfectly, and she's a native English speaker, so why don't we have her interpret for this conference that's coming up? And to me it sounded like, yeah, I can speak both languages perfectly, so it should be easy for me, right? So I didn't know what the conference was about, had no idea what the subject matter was, and I get there, and they tell me, oh, this is a petroleum conference, and so we'll be discussing mining and technical terms. And I thought, okay, I know a little bit about that. It shouldn't be too hard. So a lot of people think, I speak both languages. Well, I should be able to handle it. So I get there, and anyone here bilingual? Okay, so I get there, and I hear terms like, I'll give you a couple of examples. Okay, so quick quiz. Okay, all of you who said you're bilingual, I'm going to give you a term, and you say it in your other language, okay? Derek. Babbitt. Rat hole rig. Are these in English? These are in English. So you can imagine when I started to hear what they were saying, and I'm standing up there, and of course they didn't know how to organize simultaneous interpreters. So I was sitting, standing up next to them, and I thought, well, will I have headphones? Will I have a microphone? They said, oh no, just he's going to talk and you just speak louder. So I was completely unprepared, 19 years old. And I realized I am out of my depth. I have no idea how to do this. And, in fairness, I did give it a try, but I kept coming across words that I didn't know, so I would kind of have to paraphrase and clarify. And then I basically said, I shouldn't be doing this. And they thankfully found someone else in the audience who was an engineer, who was very familiar with the terminology, and he took over and stepped in for me. So that was my introduction to the world of interpreting. So a lot of people, when that happens, realize, oh, this isn't for me, I'm giving up. And in my case, it kind of made me realize, wow, I really have a long way to go. So I'm going to learn, I'm going to study, and I'm going to really devote myself to this. So I did. I studied a lot of technical terminology, legal terminology, medical terminology in both languages. And I would assert that interpreters and translators are made. They are definitely made. In a sense, you could say that some of them are born to be made because there are skills that you need that are very difficult to acquire over time, especially for interpreting, that your cognitive load has to be able to grow and grow, especially if you're going to be listening to a long segment and then rendering it back perfectly. You have to really be able to retain that and be able to convert that information in your head and then transfer it, which I think actually consecutive interpreting is a harder skill for that reason than simultaneous. Once you're skilled at simultaneous listening and interpreting at the same time, it actually becomes kind of like second nature. Consecutive takes a lot of practice. So to all the bilingual volunteers, thank you for feeling some of the pain that I felt when I was interpreting for the first time. How many of you know how many words there are in English? Anyone have a guess?
500,000.
More?
1 million.
1 million, yes, right on the money. At least that's an estimate that's out there. About 1 million words in English. And most people, any idea how many words most people use when they speak?
2,000.
100.
Less than 10,000.
I said between 2 and 10.
Oh, okay, yeah. So you're actually good. 4,000 to 5,000 words. So good guess, or good. I'm sure you knew that. And then how many words do you think an educated person with a college degree uses on a regular basis?
20,000.
5 to 6,000.
Between 8 and 10. Between 8 and 10,000. And for some professions, like doctors, attorneys who have a lot of specialized knowledge, how many words do you think they use on a regular basis?
Same number, just different words.
A little more. A little more. They use about 23,000 words. So whenever you're becoming specialized in an area, you learn jargon, you learn trade language. So they do use a lot of technical language. So any interpreter who's working in a technical field, like a court interpreter or a medical interpreter, they're actually using 23,000 words on a regular basis, but in more than one language. So I think that's really important to think about when we think about the skills required for interpreters and how long it takes to master that, and for translators as well. Interpreters have the additional challenge of having to have this information in their head when they're working. Translators have to have a lot of information in their heads because they have to work quickly and efficiently, but they are assisted by computers. They're assisted by computer-assisted translation tools, terminology databases. All of these kinds of tools are a standard part of translator workflow. So that gives you an idea of how interpreters and translators are made. Basically takes a lot of dedication, practice, and time to acquire the skills.
And that would be the same for hyperpolyglots, right? I mean, there's no way that you can get around putting all of that language stuff in your head without just spending a lot of time doing it, right? A lot of people have been interested and have asked me, so is there some sort of secret or some sort of method that the hyperpolyglots had, that I could use outside of like drinking more Belgian beer? I don't know. It doesn't necessarily.
Doesn't help. I tried.
It doesn't help. Yeah, so these are people who, because they've spent so much time learning languages, they have learned how they learn uniquely. So they've kind of honed in on the methods that work for them and for them uniquely. So you wouldn't necessarily want to use their recommendations because their recommendations might actually be bad for you. They might not just be neutral, they might actually be bad for you. But these people, some of them are autodidacts. Some of them take classes, are very happy in groups of people.
Sorry, what's an autodidact?
Someone who teaches
Not
themselves.
in my 8,000 words.
Someone who teaches him or herself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have any examples of some of these language acquisition techniques that might be good for one of these hyperpolyglots but very bad for somebody else?
Yeah, so one of the guys that I interviewed, Alexander Arguelles, there's a YouTube video of him talking about his daily linguistic workout, which involves studying like 20 languages in 20-minute chunks every day. He gets up at 3 in the morning and starts doing this. He does something called shadowing, and I actually did it with him, and it worked for me too, but the idea is that you take a recording in the language that you're trying to learn, and you sort of put it on, listen to it, and you go outside and you sort of walk with really exaggerated gestures like that, and then you repeat what you're hearing at the same time that you're hearing it. So there's a couple, and then so you're just automatizing sounds, and there's something about the link between the kinesthetics and the acoustics, right, in the brain. So, and then you would go and you would look at the text and actually look at what is being said. It also has this interesting effect of kind of inoculating you or neutralizing some of the embarrassment that you would feel when you are using a foreign language because you've been marching around outside in public. Walking in this,
starts at 3 in the morning.
Walking in this Monty Python-esque sort of way. And a range. There was Emil Krebs. I didn't put a picture of him up here, but he was a German diplomat in China, and he used to favor walking around this studying, totally naked, drunk on German beer in his case, and working on the sort of refreshing or refreshing the language that he was working on at a particular moment. And he used to spend so much time doing this during the night that when it came time to actually do his translator job, he was one cranky guy, and he was a cranky guy anyway. So he was not that fun to be around. And there's lots of there's kind of idiosyncratic individuals in a lot of ways. But made, or born to be made, they need to make themselves, and they face a lot of the same challenges that everybody else does, which is where do you find the time, how do you have a life given this pursuit as well, and how do you keep the languages in your brain? A lot of them talked about sort of having a central set of active languages and then a set of languages that were on ice that they could activate at any particular time.
Why do they say they do it?
Why do they say they do it? A lot of people, like a lot of different reasons. Some people, they're not all raised in bilingual environments. Some of them are just they're clearly drawn to systems and to patterns and to pattern recognition. And there's a way in which some of them have kind of figured out that there's this sort of social behavior called language, and maybe it doesn't come quite as sort of naturally to them as to other people, but if you figure out the rules of this sort of social behavior, you can actually fit in, and there are lots of different sets of rules to learn, and when you learn those different sets, you can have lots of interactions with lots of different people. They like to travel, they like to, they like to feel competent, and I think there's also a way in which a lot of the people that I met, outside of the fact that they're just highly verbal, right? It's like there's not enough time for them to say everything that they want to say in English, but there's kind of this kind of childlikeness, in a sense, which you can take a couple ways, right? One is I want to explore, I want to be curious, but it's also like I don't want to be a competent adult, right? I don't want to be judged as a competent adult and someone who is sort of marked as a non-native speaker and as a learner of a language. Hopefully, in most situations, or in a lot of situations, not at all, will be sort of accorded a certain kind of accommodation, right, so that they don't have to really perform like adults do. And that's just some of the people. There are other people who are
You described what I feel are a lot of people who successfully got into the Google interview process.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting sort of question. Like, at the point where, would there be more interest in natural languages, natural human languages, if there weren't computer languages to sort of soak up a lot of that neurology and a lot of that systemizing kind of intelligence? Somebody else?
Yeah, I heard. So here's a story I read about years ago, and I was wondering whether you heard the same story. It's about this, I think, police or someone just in a prison cell next to a couple men in another cell who were condemned to die for some reason, and they were talking amongst themselves in language that he had not heard before, wasn't familiar with. But he basically acquired the knowledge of this language and was able to argue to the captors, about their situation or something like that. Have you heard this story? It was back in, ancient times, not ancient
Yeah, so I have a different version of that anecdote. Let me do that anecdote and then we'll move on. But I heard the version of the anecdote about Cardinal Mezzofanti,
Yes.
this priest. So it wasn't about overhearing a conversation, it was about two prisoners who had been condemned to die in the morning, and that no one had heard their confession yet. And no one could because no one knew their language. So Mezzofanti went in and learned their language, and then at dawn was able to send them off to the gallows.
Okay. from listening to talk, he somehow independently acquired knowledge of language.
Yeah.
That seems more believable to me.
Oh, what Mezzofanti?
Well, what
Or
the
the story
anecdote that you told.
Yeah, rather than just overhearing it. Yeah.
But there's a case of Kenneth Hale, who was an MIT linguist who claimed to have been able to pick up languages just by listening to people. I mean, really? I always wondered if that was really the case. I mean, he's dead now, so we can't ask him.
Yeah, and I've got a whole section in the book about Hale, who's a really interesting case of just like what happens to people when a certain number of languages gets attached to their name. It becomes this kind of oppressive sort of thing that they can't quite escape. He actually himself said, I can only speak 3 languages. He was also a modest guy, so people take that to mean that just as a performance of his modesty, right? But if you take it in a different way, he was actually making a legitimate kind of linguistic claim about his abilities. I can only speak 3 languages. I can talk in many more languages, and the ability to talk in those languages is much easier to sort of acquire. And he didn't do it just by listening, but he did it through actively eliciting stuff from people. So the next question that we have is, how many languages do they know? And you have something like that.
Yeah, so, well, I guess the answer to this question is define no. So it's kind of like what Ken Hale struggled with, I can't really claim that I'm fully fluent in these languages, but I do happen to know a little bit of them. And I maybe can navigate. I said 4,000 to 5,000 is what we typically use in English, or what most people use in English on a regular basis. 4,000 to 5,000 words isn't that much to learn, when you think about it. So you could navigate in most languages, but can you say the word Derek in your other language? So when it comes to translators and interpreters, it's not the number of languages that they know, it's the depth at which they know them. Anybody have a guess as to how many languages on average most translators and interpreters know? Or let me put it this way, how many languages they use for their work? In other words, how many languages they translate into and out of? 2 or 3. I hear 5, 3, and the correct answer, 2. 1.5. Yes, and the comment was that only goes one way, right? So for translators, for people who are producing what kind of output? Text, written, yes. So for translators, they are generally going into their native language. So generally it's because if you want written language, you want it to sound natural and native. There are some disadvantages to that actually though, because if they're going into their stronger language, there's potential for comprehension errors. But that's the standard. That's how most translators work. So I worked from Spanish into English most of the time. Now, conference interpreters, anybody have an idea how they go? What direction they go in? So they go from their passive languages, languages they can understand, into their active languages. So comprehension, as a lot of us know, how many of you have studied languages that, well, I can understand a lot, but I just can't speak? And some people are more comfortable speaking and not comprehending. So, you have different types of skills when you're learning a language. So conference interpreters generally do actually go into they have a couple of passive languages and they go into their native language. So like a United Nations interpreter might be, listening in French and English and interpreting into Arabic, for example. Community interpreters who work in courts and hospitals and who are actually the most popular type of interpreter, the most common that you'll find in schools and all around us. They go in both directions. They have to interpret in and out of both languages. So You know, I gave you some examples of technical terminology, but you can imagine in a courtroom, you know, anything can come up. In addition to having to know all the law and all the legal terminology that could come up, you also have to know anything that could come up in testimony, given as evidence, and all of those kinds of technical tests. They bring in an expert witness. You suddenly have to know all that terminology that the expert witness knows in both languages. So one of the big skills that interpreters have to have, because it's kind of impossible to know everything about a language, and in fact in some languages you don't even have exact linguistic equivalents for things, is one of the skills is paraphrasing, being able to explain something quickly and convey the meaning. So one of the first tests that I took as an interpreter, I was being tested over the phone on telephone interpreting, and there was a sentence that just tripped me up. It was in my brain, but I couldn't remember the word for hardware store. And this was in the midst of a long sentence. I went to the hardware store and I bought blah, 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 blah. So I knew all the other words, but I didn't remember hardware store. So I had to say a place where you buy tools and materials for building. But I had to come up with that really quickly, and I felt so horrible that I missed that term. But they said, no, actually, that's one of the skills that you need as an interpreter, to be able to do that in real time on the fly. So Taboo is an excellent game to practice if you want to become an interpreter. So the answer to this question, there are, of course, interpreters and translators who do work in more than just one combination. And as I mentioned, conference interpreters tend to go a couple passive languages into an active language. But in general, the average on the whole is 2. Yeah?
If you get all the conference interpreters together and all the community interpreters together, do you have all the interpreters, or are there other categories left over?
There's something called, and I don't like this term, but escort interpreter, who is basically someone who accompanies a business person. Now what happens is there's not enough of that kind of contract work to really keep an interpreter employed. Most interpreters and translators are freelancers. There are some, of course, who have full-time jobs, like at hospitals and courts, but the majority are freelancing. So you do have other types of interpreting, but those are the 2 biggest by far. And of course, there's telephone interpreting, which that was one of my first interpreting jobs, which I interpreted for 911 calls, insurance agencies, anything you can do over the phone, those calls get interpreted. I was working at the time with a company called AT&T Language Line, a division of AT&T. So that's another type, and video interpreting is becoming more popular. I will say, sign language, because of the ADA, there are interpreters who work in many more settings than for spoken languages in the US. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, deaf and hard of hearing individuals have the right to an interpreter anywhere. So that their rights cannot be denied to them. Now, under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, individuals who are not proficient in English, limited English proficient, LEP individuals, have the right to an interpreter or translator or language access, somebody who speaks their language, anywhere that an institution or a company receives any federal money. So that means that every state agency, county agency, city agency is required to provide language assistance to people who don't speak English. That's under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, to prevent discrimination on the basis of national origin.
And that's federal grant, not federal contract, as in somebody selling something.
Actually, it can be any federal money. So even if you got a small contract, you got a small grant for eco-friendly lighting or something, you're required, if someone comes to your door and speaks another language, to provide them with assistance. And usually the way that's done, because not everybody can afford to employ interpreters or bilingual people, is they simply sign up for a service where they can access an interpreter over the phone. So that usually meets the compliance requirements. So I've answered more than how many languages they know.
You have a table, you have a chart.
I do, actually. Yeah, so this is basically what I just covered. Translators, the formats of text-to-text, non-native and to native. Subtitle translators, which is another form of translation that's quite popular, especially as video is becoming more important on the web. Speech-to-text, non-native into your native language. Conference interpreters, speech-to-speech, generally are going into their native language. And community interpreters sometimes do text-to-speech, because if I'm in a hospital and somebody brings in medication that they brought from their home country, I have to read that information and then render it in speech so the doctor can understand what it says. So that goes non-native into native and back and forth.
How do you classify the subtitle translator who's just going English to English text?
Well, they're usually just doing subtitle transcription.
Okay.
Yeah, so that they're usually not grouped in the same category as translators. Usually, not always, but 99% of the time, translators are going from one language into another. There are cases where they go from a variant of a language into another. So I've been asked, for example, to neutralize Spanish from, let's say, Argentina and make it appropriate for the US market, which is largely Mexico, but also has many, many other types of Spanish, and believe it or not, there's a huge degree of linguistic variation. You know, we have more than 40 words for popcorn in Spanish. And there are lots of words that mean something harmless in one variety of Spanish that means something completely offensive in another. And believe me, that is a minefield. So, yeah. And you have?
Yeah, just as this question of how many languages hyperpolyglots know, this is the kind of profile of a European Commission translator. His languages arranged in the order that he learned them on 3 different dimensions: his speaking ability, his listening ability, and his reading ability. These are all self-reports. I gave him a self-report sort of version of the test of functional abilities that the US government uses. And I don't have translating, and I don't have writing, and I think that the self-assessment test has not been adapted yet. But you see, a lot of variation across all of his abilities, even within languages. And you can see some biographical, when you know him, some biographical things, pop out. One is that of all of the languages, he spent a long time living in a Spanish-speaking country. So even though he doesn't use that language, he reported proficiencies that were fairly high. And he's also married to a Slovak. So he speaks Slovakian at home. And interestingly, even though this is a guy who, he says that he translates, I think, from 13 languages into English. So this is somebody who's like linguistically prodigious by one measure. He's working on Chinese right now, and Chinese is kicking his butt. He's older. He's also not just learning speaking, but he's learning how to. He's trying to become literate as well. Given the sort of work that he does, that would be important to do.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how do you have a proficiency rating in speaking but not in listening?
Yeah.
This is interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that's my experience with sign language.
I don't know, I've met a lot of people like that.
Yeah, it's not that hard to learn how to make some of the sounds, but not be able to hear them back at speed and interpret it.
Yeah, that's interesting.
You know some phrases.
So how does Latin kind of come into this, right? Because I think it's very underlying language. It's called dead language, unfortunately. It's very nice. But medical translation, for example, in medical field, you really speak Latin a lot. So really saying I'm translating from English to you actually knowing another underlying language, you have to, right?
Yeah.
I mean, is it really that dead?
I can answer on the translation side, and you probably have something to say as well. Definitely, languages with Latin roots often, do use the Latin terms or terms that are very closely related. So it's very common in Spanish, for example, that the words you use sound very technical if you translate them directly. So, like the word for ear, nose, and throat in Spanish is otorrinolaryngologo. So you use the Latin roots, and also like hysterosalpingogram. Well, you can say that in English, and it might confuse people, but in Spanish it sort of makes more sense because the roots are still there. So translators actually have to sometimes de-Latinize when they're going from a Latin language into medical English so that it doesn't sound higher register than it should in English. Yeah.
In the case of the hyperpolyglots, Latin shows up in a different sort of way. So a lot of the historical hyperpolyglots you see in their repertoire, you see a lot of Latin in ancient Greek, which was a matter of the educational system. But it turns out that those two languages are pretty powerful, right? Because you get access to Indo-European and very old Indo-European roots and things like that. Latin, certainly because of the lexical stuff, but the grammar, dealing with Latin grammar, sets you up very nicely to work with languages that have also very rich case systems, like Russian and other Slavic languages, for instance. And so just as a matter of sort of developing the habits of mind for learning all of that stuff and crunching through that, Latin turned out to be really useful.
Right, I'm from Czech Republic, speaking also.
Yeah.
And I know that the medical schools, when you study medicine, 1 year you have to study Latin. Yeah.
Yep.
So, here, I would assume that hyperpolyglots have the next couple of languages, a wish list. Once you decide this is something you like to do, it's like the next movie. I mean, I'm actually a programming language junkie. I probably don't have enough skill to actually.
Well, the URL hyperpolyglot.org, I was like, oh, this is cool. There's like it's for programming languages.
I will literally buy a programming language manual at the beginning of the summer and read it for my summer vacation.
Yeah.
And only a couple people laughed, you'll notice. So, but I kind of had in the back of my head, it would be interesting to learn that one and that one and that one. Is it the same thing? If you ask, do they say, oh yeah? And is it for structural reasons or cultural reasons, or are there languages that's like, that one's really hard, so it's a really interesting challenge, even though I never expect to travel there, or is it more?
There's all kinds of reasons, but I think what's important is that hyperpolyglots are often kind of criticized or sort of mocked for having like trophy languages. That once you know Italian, well, all of the other Romance languages are just a breeze, so they say that they know those. But on the survey that I did of about 300 people, I asked people for all of their languages and in the order that they learned them, and you actually find people hopping back and forth between language families. So they don't have the kind of mop-up approach, they actually switch, which is based on, sometimes they want to explore historical roots, sometimes it's about sort of access to materials. So one guy whose picture was up there, he wanted to study languages with historical links to Turkish, but all of those languages were in what was then Soviet control. So all of the grammars and dictionaries were in Russian, so he went Russian.
So it's funny, in programming we also use the term polyglot, but to mean a program that is valid in multiple languages. So it's something that is similar to the normal world definition of it.
Yeah. But you get similar kinds of questions. I mean, I've seen some of the, is it possible to really program? What does it mean to know a programming language? Is it really possible to know? And I see people kind of bemoaning this sort of hyperpolyglot approach because it means that nobody knows one language really well.
So would you say that it's typical for a hyperpolyglot to span so many different language families? Because I count at least 5 up there.
Yeah, I mean, they have these repertoires that are, like Mezzofanti had something like 11 language families and 7 scripts, assuming that he was literate in all of them, and a lot of them have that same kind of span. You're talking multiple writing systems and multiple language families.
What triggers that?
It's a big world.
Also, I think the language family is a very human, taxonomic thing that you approach onto a natural formation, right? Like the difference between a bunch of languages is actually much more fluid than we would care to admit. But and their languages are more defined by geopolitical boundaries, and maybe it's similar with language families. But I know, in India, Indo-European and Dravidian languages share so much common vocabulary that if someone was really to slow down a Hindi speaker, I could probably understand at least a bit of what they're saying, even though it's never really.
And I have
but across language families, I mean, they're sometimes you just get nothing for free.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Oh, even within families?
No, across families.
Oh, across families, right, yeah.
I worked at a speech company before, and like the average person on our team knew something like 7 languages, right? That was terrible, right? Like I knew one and a smattering of Spanish, but you know, a lot of it was honestly driven by where, you know, the market was. Like they had a lot of excitement that like, oh, we're bringing aboard Indonesian, opportunity to really learn and do Indonesian and go over there and work with people to gather samples, and you know, so they would get excited to go to a new market, you know, because they would like, oh, finally we can break into that and really have an excuse to live there for a while and collect data. But you know, it's kind of amazing when guys like, yeah, a couple of weeks got Indonesian, you know.
And that would be sort of the environment where like a hyperpolyglot would do better. I mean, someone who is a translator and interpreter could go into that, but they wouldn't necessarily have gravitated towards that, right? Given that their learning is much deeper in any language.
I think another piece is availability of language resources to learn, because I mean, I'm not a hyperpolyglot, but I maybe someday will become one, I hope. I've studied 7 languages, and I remember, you know, looking at the college course list in Ecuador, and they had 5 languages, and I thought, yes, I want all of them, you know, and it was because they were the ones that were offered, and you know, that included Japanese and German and French and Italian and you know, Arabic, and so, you know, they were all diverse, but I thought, I'll take whatever I can get. You know, if they had offered Quechua, I would have taken that probably instead of Japanese, but you know, I think that might be a driving factor for some people. Wasn't my case anyway.
Do you want to, we have 2 topic areas. Yeah. We should pick one. You want to pick one? Or ask them to pick one?
Yeah.
Do you want to hear about why they matter from our perspective, or do you want to hear about our assessment of the future of translators and hyperpolyglots?
Why do that?
Future.
I have to leave right away anyway,
so. Future.
What is the future of translators? I guess I really want to answer the question of why they matter, but I will just tell you that's answered in the book. That's what the whole book explains, is their importance on our everyday lives. But as for what's the future, I have a chapter on that at the very end of the book, in which, anyone know the name Franz Oak? The creator of Google Translate? So I actually interviewed him in Mountain View and talked to him about the future of translation. I also interviewed Greg Kurzweil, who is now a Googler as well, has since become one, and talked to them about their view of the future and what's going to happen with translation. So anyone think that translators and interpreters will be replaced eventually, someday? It's okay, you can say it if you believe it.
Translators maybe, but I don't think interpreters.
That's what a lot of people say, because of the complexity of speech, and text is much easier to automate. There are a few types of machine translation. Google Translate is called statistical machine translation, based on lots of data. And there is also something called rules-based machine translation, which basically you write the rules in detail for how to treat different verbs and, you know, subject-noun agreement, or subject-verb agreement, gender, all of those kinds of things. And then there's a hybrid approach to machine translation. And there are a lot of efforts to automate speech, and in fact Google has been involved in some. And some of them are quite successful, but for very limited domains and for very specific language pairs. And also this whole thing about, you know, speaking, comprehension, you know, these different abilities. Well, look at computers. You know, computers can usually produce spoken language much more easily than they can comprehend, because of all the different variation in people's speech patterns. And that might be why you see some people evaluate their listening and their comprehension lower than their speech, because in some cases it can be quite hard. There's a lot of individual variation. So the future of translators, I think, is quite bright. I follow the market as a researcher, and the language services market for translation and interpreting has been growing at double-digit growth rates, compound annual growth rates, for the last 10 years. And as more people are getting access to information, translation is becoming more and more important. And in the translation community, a lot of people absolutely hate Google Translate, because they think that it leads to really poor translations, that a human could have done better, and so they absolutely cannot stand Google Translate because of the impact that they see in people thinking, oh, well, that's just easy, you just drop it in Google Translate. But I think Google Translate and other such free services are actually creating a bigger market for translation, because it's increasing the awareness of, oh, it maybe doesn't have to be so hard. So what's happening is a lot of people are using that. Maybe they put the content up on their website, customers can find them because their SEO increases, but then suddenly customers are complaining, oh, you have a mistranslation here, this doesn't make sense. So then they're actually paying for professional post-editing, is what it's called. A human translator cleans up the machine translation output, or they're simply paying a human to do it. So it's actually driving awareness, driving market demand for professional human services. And Ray Kurzweil agreed with me that he believes that there is definitely a point where machine translation of text will equal human output, because remember, human output isn't perfect either. And a lot of that is very subjective. So, but he does believe that simultaneous interpretation of speech across languages will probably not reach what humans can do. So that's an assessment of the future.
I think what's cool listening to you talk about the future of translators is that, and translation, is that there are really no sort of cliches or platitudes that you sort of touch on or have to use to promise a sort of future. But I think if you talk about the future of hyperpolyglots, you have to talk about the world shrinking and access to information. Just kind of lots of cliches. I think it's a similarly bright sort of future, to the degree that people have better access and faster access to language learning resources and to native speakers online, so you can actually do more without getting up. And I think also the kinds of organizational and institutional environments that use and develop the sort of hyperpolyglot neurology are increasing as well. So those people who might have that aptitude, who would just be out there and never get the opportunity, are actually going to have access to that more increasingly. On the flip side of that, though, is the thing that came up earlier, was the degree to which interest in programming languages kind of stokes up. And it would be interesting to talk about why programming languages are more attractive than human languages. I mean, and I think the boundedness and the discreteness of one versus the other is, and we could talk about that, but is definitely what makes one more attractive.
Do many of these hyperpolyglots make a living at it, or is it an avocation?
Yeah, so one of the slides that we skipped was, where do they work or where do you find them? And I kind of split them into two groups. There are kind of institutionalized ones, like Graham, So they work in an organization that is multilingual, where being multilingual and learning languages is an expected part of the job. He gets 2 months professional development to go to another country to learn either one language that he has or a language that he wants to learn. And he may never actually ever translate with that language, but it's just—
What organization?
The European Commission.
Oh.
And that's just sort of expected. So, he's not a dilettante, he's not considered in that sort of environment. Then there are people who are kind of uninstitutionalized. So the guy who did the shadowing, that sort of marching sort of thing, when I met him, he was unemployed doing translation work in Korean. He's now employed as a linguistics professor in Oman. A lot of them are academics. Some of them are translators. So one of the ways in which there is a certain amount of similarity between the translators and the hyperpolyglots is that the hyperpolyglots, for exactly that sort of reason, end up doing translation work of various types. Translation work and not interpretation, right? I don't know that I've met anyone who is an interpreter.
Yeah. Translation, if you have enough time and you're not, if you're doing it maybe not on a professional level for all languages, a lot of poets, for example, will translate poetry because they can basically find other translations, compare the music dictionary, use resources. They have the luxury of time to really research things, understand them thoroughly, and produce a translation. So it is possible. Most professional translators, however, don't have that luxury because they have to produce a certain number of words per hour in order to make a living.
How many words per hour is that?
Well, the average is about 2,500 words per day. And that hasn't changed much even with computer-assisted translation tools and machine translation tools that they're using. So
how's like the accuracy gone? Like if that's even a metric that's measured, right?
you know, there is a lack of measurement of these types of things. The market is very fragmented, so there aren't a lot of good studies out there to show that. But one of the benefits of using tools is precisely accuracy and consistency of terminology, which is really important, especially when you've got, you know, brand voice guidelines that differ from one company to another, and companies that create their own terminology. And you know, we have a lot of examples in the book of this kind of thing. You know, translators for Harlequin romance novels, interpreters who interpret for astronauts, you know, interpreters who interpret for celebrities. I mean, and translators and interpreters work in just so many different technical areas that, you know, that is an ongoing challenge for them to make sure that they have consistent terminology and using other sources to make sure that whatever they're producing is in alignment with other information that's out there.
And then do they like feed this back somewhere? Because that's kind of the important part to improve computer translation, right? Like,
yes, and you know, this is the thing. So most of the files that they're creating are called translation memory files. So they're basically a database of translations. So they have, you know, a column with the source language and a column with the target language. So the tools that they use will show them, you know, a fuzzy match or a perfect match. It will show, oh, 98% of this segment looks like something that you translated before. And it will pop up and it will show them, and then they can just simply correct or tweak it to make it perfect. So translators amass these translation memory files. Sometimes they deliver them back to the client, sometimes they don't. So there's all this data, and I know you guys can see the problem with this, that isn't being shared with anyone and is being stored usually on individual personal computers in people's homes. And Google actually has something called the Translator Toolkit, which is designed to help people be able to store this and leverage it. But there are entrenched providers that have been there for decades, and they tend to use those tools that are installed locally on their, you know, local computer. So there is a tendency to move things toward the cloud, and I think then we can harvest that information. But let's not forget, one of the other reasons that people like to preserve that information is because of confidentiality and a lot of the stuff that they're translating. So there is this debate of, you know, how much should go to the cloud and how much do we want to keep secure, and you know, there's a lot of discussions about that.
That would be a really cool way to leak a nuclear secret. It's like a state secret. Like,
yeah.
Oh, it turns out we have really good translation for all things nuclear between like Farsi and English.
Oh, and believe me, I mean, there are lots of interpreters and translators who are doing that work. I mean, I used to get recorded transcripts, you know, from intelligence agencies, and I would get the recordings, and I would have to create the transcripts. So this is another variant that I didn't put there, where you're listening and you're transcribing and you're translating at the same time. So, and I would hear all kinds of things. Of course, I didn't have the big picture to know what this was related to, you know, but yeah, if you would harness all that information, and the CIA intelligence agencies have had a really hard problem with this. They haven't been able to recruit enough translators and interpreters, especially for critical languages like Dani and Pashto, and even Arabic, which is a pretty widely spoken language, but not everybody wants to do that type of work. So, yeah, so.
Well, thank you very much again.